I'm Dr. Liberty Barnes. I'm a sociologist and a member of the American Sociological Association. This summer was supposed to be our annual meetings in San Francisco, but due to the pandemic, we are doing the sessions for this conference online as what is called the ASA Virtual Engagement Event. This particular panel is called Envisioning Real Utopias in Medicine and Healthcare. We focus on the work of Erik Olin Wright, who argued for emancipatory social science, or research that evaluates institutions and communities according to moral principles of equality, democracy, and sustainability, develops viable alternatives for institutions that fall short, and advances theories of transformation that foster real utopias, institutions and communities that promote human flourishing and alleviate human suffering. While Wright's work has been applied to the study of markets, income, the family, and community organizations, less attention has been paid to whether and how Wright's vision applies to medicine, healthcare, and public health. This session examines the achievement of equality, democracy, and sustainability in medicine. We recognize the shortcomings of the medical system, laud efforts to create real utopias, identify potential utopic spaces, and make recommendations for sustaining medical utopias. Thank you for coming to our session today, and I hope you enjoy it. Let's just begin by introducing each one of the panelists and our discussant for today. So our first panelist is Nancy Lopez. Nancy is professor of sociology at the University of New Mexico. She is the co-founder and director of the Institute for the Study of Race and Social Justice and the founding coordinator of the New Mexico statewide Race, Gender, Class Data Policy Consortium. Professor Lopez is the author of Hopeful Girls, Troubled Boys, Race and Gender Disparity in Urban Education, and Mapping Race, Critical Approaches to Health Disparities Research. In 2018, she received the William Foote White Distinguished Career Award from the ASA section for Sociological Practice and Public Sociology. Kevin Moseby. Kevin Moseby is a faculty member of Drexel University's Sociology Department and faculty affiliate at Drexel Center for Science, Technology, and Society. Professor Moseby is currently at work on his first book manuscript, an analysis of the color of HIV/AIDS in the United States since 1981, which is under advanced contract with New York University Press. Congratulations. Professor Moseby is a first-generation college graduate and has never seen Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, although he is a great lover of film. Alexandra Vincent is assistant professor of learning health sciences at the University of Michigan. She is the author of several articles describing how the American medical profession changes over time and how those changes are reflected in medical training. Professor Vincent is a co-founder and a leader of the Sociology of Health Professions Education Collaborative. Her new research focuses on the development of innovative healthcare networks. And finally, our discussant today is Laura Mamo. Laura Mamo is professor of public health in San Francisco at San Francisco State University, where she is also faculty researcher at the Health Equity Institute and Center for Research on Gender and Sexuality. Her research and teaching has focused broadly on biomedicine and issues around sexual and reproductive health, rights, and justice. Professor Mamo co-convenes the Science, Technology, and Society Research Hub at San Francisco State and is working on a book on precision public health and cancer prevention. So let's just begin by getting the background, the research background for each of our panelists. Can you please explain your field sites to us, your research fields conceptually and the actual field sites and their locations? Who are the various actors at your field sites? What resources are there and who controls them? And what are the rules and who enforces them? I also wanted to add, maybe you can tell us what your preferred methods are, what kind of methods you use in your research. So let's go ahead and start with Nancy.
Buenas tardes, familia. Good afternoon, family. I'm Nancy Lopez, and I'm professor in sociology at the University of New Mexico. And most of my work has been leveraging the conceptual use of critical race theory and intersectionality as inseparable. So what that means in practice is that any work that I do, primarily qualitative, but lately doing quantitative race work, looking at things like the social determinants of health, education in particular, I think about the importance of keeping present that race and gender are not individual level social constructions, but that they're structural. I also recognize the importance of examining the social movements that created things like Head Start, that created things like Upward Bound, and that created opportunity structures for those that would not normally have access to higher ed. So my field sites have been New York City, which is where I did my preliminary work. But as I said, lately I've been also employing quantitative data collection, looking at Latinos in particular, and this tendency to assume that all Latinos are racialized the same way. That is not true. There are many Latinos who, anyone on this call could be Latino, and we all have very different racial positions, right? There are light-skinned, very white-looking Latinos. There are Afro-Latinos like myself, and there's indigenous. So I'm also trying to disrupt this narrative of there's a homogenous Latino experience. It varies according to your racial status, and it's gendered. And yeah, and the last thing I'll mention is that I'm also working on a mixed method study that examines how ethnic studies curriculum is a lever for reducing inequalities for students, racial and ethnic minority students primarily, but looking at it in a way that looks at intersectionality. I did do a quantitative study of graduation rates in a public university that will remain nameless, that examines odds ratios for graduating using social locations. So comparing everyone to high income white women and seeing that class is not a proxy for racial and gender gaps. So the same is true for health outcomes. We cannot assume class is a proxy for that. We need a critical race intersectional lens.
Thank you very much, Nancy. That was very fascinating, and really it's a great addition to this panel. Kevin, will you tell us about your research, please?
Sure, thank you. I am a sociologist of biomedicine, public health, and race. And as for field site, I study Black American health activism centrally. And that concerns comes from my interest in sort of intervening into sociological work that as I was studying as an undergraduate and graduate student, I was always concerned with what I saw as a reification of this notion that Black Americans were not doing anything about particularly HIV/AIDS, and that they were, and I kept hearing as I was reading that Black Americans were, homophobic and conservative, and that just wasn't matching what I was seeing among Black Americans. And I went to undergrad and graduate school first in the Bay Area in California. And I grew up in Arkansas, and I was like, well, Black Americans are much more complex and diverse than what I'm seeing in the literature. And I was just like, well, this doesn't describe what I see and know and live. And I thought, well, this is not true. And the literature is old, it's not up to date. It needs to be updated. And so that what drew me to ask the questions that I asked, and to say, well, we need to actually hear from the Black Americans and account for their experiences, their understandings within the fields of medicine and within the fields of public health. And so the actors that populate the sites that I studied are the Black Americans themselves as they travel and transverse the domains of biomedicine that's within the the public health institutions, but also within the domains of medicine, going to the doctor's offices, and things such as that. Methods, I do qualitative work because I am interested into the meanings and the understandings and the day-to-days, struggles and lives and dreams of Black Americans as they live day in and day out, year after year, within dealing with health and public health and biomedical institutions. You want to hear more?
That was great. Actually, I wanted to ask, in your book, is it based on interviews with a specific community?
My book is in process. It's a different methods, interviews with Black American HIV/AIDS activists and advocates, as well as public health, mainly Centers for Disease Control, administrators and workers, as well as just observation at public health conferences.
Okay, got it. Thank you. And Alexandra, why don't you share?
Hi, everyone. It's really great to be here with you today. I'm primarily an ethnographer, and an important through line in my work is that I study medical power and how it's reproduced in new generations of trainees, but also how it can be reproduced and contained within healthcare organizations. And right now for my research, I study a set of innovative multi-stakeholder networks that are called learning networks. And learning networks are these collaborative groups that are organized around shared problems of interest. And these shared problems of interest are often, but not always, related to specific health conditions. And the people who make up learning networks are patients, families, healthcare providers, researchers, community and advocacy organizations. And learning networks often have really strong ties to academic medical centers, which pay a fee to be involved in the network and are a site where much of the activity of the network, namely caring for patients, takes place. Learning networks tend to be most common in the United States, but there are international learning networks. And learning networks are seen as a way of achieving a learning health system, which the National Academy of Medicine has been promoting for the past decade or so. A learning health system is a system that continuously learns, where members use quality improvement methodology to systematically gather data about healthcare provision and system level and health status and quality of life of patients. And they can use this data to implement both individual and system level changes to improve health outcomes. Learning networks answer calls to systematically improve healthcare, and they've been around for about a decade. And as you can see, they have a lot of elements that make them very interesting. And one of the questions that motivates my work is exactly how innovative are they? What sort of potential do they contain to fundamentally readjust some of the major power imbalances that we see when we look at the provision of healthcare? So for the past couple of years, I've been conducting a field study of the development and the operations of 4 of these networks. And it's funded by the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, or PCORI. PCORI is a nonprofit research institute that was created as part of the Affordable Care Act. It funds a lot of research on best practices and comparative effectiveness research. Of course, all of the statements that I make in the presentation are solely the responsibility of me as the author and don't necessarily represent the views of PCORI, its board of governors, or the methodology committee. And as I mentioned, the sort of innovative potential of learning networks is what is really pulling me to talk about them in the context of Wright's theories. And one of the things about them is they really do make good on inviting a diverse set of stakeholders to the table, a much more diverse set of stakeholders to the table than we would normally expect in discussions around healthcare. And learning networks give these participants robust agenda setting power for what the network will do. And because they do this, they do have potential for shifting these entrenched power relations in healthcare. However, because learning networks are embedded within institutions that do not necessarily adjust their own social relations or hierarchies, etc., the emancipatory of learning networks might always fall short. And in some ways, the project may never be delivering on its full potential. In addition, learning networks rely on the collection and the aggregation of very large amounts of data, patient data, in order to understand and reduce unintended variation in care. And this means that participants in learning networks face really complex data governance tasks, both in developing novel practices of data sharing and the new norms that accompany these practices. And they've got to figure out how to integrate their much more progressive stance towards data sharing into the conventional world of IRBs and data use agreements that are so customary in academic science. So overall, learning networks, I find them to be a very exciting example of what can happen when a broader group of stakeholders converges and renegotiates how healthcare will take place. But as I mentioned, innovation has hard limits because of the way learning networks are embedded in conventional healthcare organizations and conventional social institutions. And so studying learning networks is giving me an opportunity to apply the existing sociological diagnoses and critiques of medical care to observe networks as they develop and they vet alternatives, and to work with learning networks on their projects of transformation.
Liberty, you're on mute.
Okay, thank you, Alexandra. I actually just had one quick little question. When you talk about the unique set of stakeholders that are represented on the learning networks, can you just give us a list of who might be in those learning networks?
Sure. So learning networks are all of the people who are normally involved in healthcare. So patients and their families, the providers themselves, and researchers who are always kind of abstractly involved in healthcare. But in a learning network, they actually come together into the same room or into the same Zoom interface, and they work together on what the network will do. And they collaborate on that work. And that work can vary. It can be things like developing a data registry, but also developing all of the items that, all the sort of questions that patients will have to answer. At every level of activity within a learning network, you're supposed to see the same broad composition of stakeholders participating in an egalitarian way.
Okay, thank you. That was really interesting. I'm going to go through the questions, and each time we can start with Nancy, but Nancy, if you want to defer to someone else to start on a round of answers, that's fine too. So this first question is about equality. So Wright laid out his 3 principles of emancipatory social science: equality, democracy, and sustainability. And we're going to discuss each of those concepts and how they relate or don't relate to your field sites. So let's start with equality. Wright says, in a socially just society, all people would have broadly equal access to the social and material conditions necessary for living a flourishing life. So in your research, what are the challenges to achieving equality? And have you found spaces of equality? That is, practices, policies, or communities that are working toward equality? And what might you see as practical solutions that could help move medicine toward equality? And I would also add, I am guessing that all of you have seen inequality. So you can start by telling us the main problems you see with inequality, and if you've seen any kind of spaces that are leaving room for moving toward equality. Nancy, would you like to start?
Sure, I'll kick us off. So I think the way that I think of it is in terms of equity and justice and adopting a human rights framework. So when I hear conversations happening among primarily public health researchers, but also beyond, that are still having this hackneyed debate about, is class more important than race? Again, I go back to the conceptual underpinnings of how we understand intersectional justice and intersectional liberation. So instead of asking what's more important, if you adopt a critical race intersectional perspective, you would say, how does racialized capitalism heteropatriarchy, settler colonialism interact to produce a constellation of structural inequities, whether I'm in New Mexico, which is where I've been for the last 2 decades, or whether I'm in New York City in public housing, where across the street there's, people who live in co-ops that have a completely different social geography in terms of the social determinants of health, even though they're literally across the street, right? Their networks are different, the occupational status is different, how they're racialized, and the intergenerational wealth transfers are completely different, right? Because of structural violence. So I think what we need to do is shift the conversation from equality to, again, human rights and equity that's anchored in intersectional justice. And some of the policies that I know have worked in different sites, and I would urge everyone to visit Duke University's Center on Social Equity. William Darity, an economist, has been doing an enormous amount of work on the racialized wealth gap. And, I would add gendered gap. So there are policies like baby bonds, universal health care, full employment, guaranteed basic income that we know would actually mitigate all of these inequities that we see manifested in health inequities. So he is more of an expert on where those policies have been implemented. It's a political process, right? Who will be implementing? But I've heard that there are several municipal governments that have adopted policies like that. I know Seattle has tried instituting policies that address racialized wealth gaps and structural racism and intersectional violence, but there are probably other innovations underway. I think New Mexico is ripe for that. And I think that we, as one of the states that has one of the highest poverty rates, is a case study of settler colonialism, white supremacy, and intersectional violence, and all the health inequities that go along with that. So this is a place where we can experiment with policies that we know have worked to change that. So yeah, in a nutshell, I think we have to be very critically reflective on our own social location and systems of violence and oppression. And that might mean recognizing that we may be benefiting, right, from existing arrangements. Critical race theory also makes the claim that democracy and white supremacy are mutually reinforcing. So how is it that liberal democracy is actually part and parcel of the way in which we are experiencing this level of racialized and gendered inequity? So I think it requires a lot of deep reflecting. And 2 books that I would recommend, Tufuku Suberi's Thicker Than Blood, How Racial Statistics Lie. That's a powerful book, and the co-edited volume that Eduardo Bonilla Silva and Tufuku Suberi, White Logic, White Methods, Racism and Methodology. Again, I think another fetish is to debate whether qualitative or quantitative is better. They're both great and they're both useful. And I absolutely love mixed methods, even though I primarily identify as a qualitative researcher. I think they're both valuable, and those works show the value for interrogating things like equality.
Thank you. That was excellent, Nancy. I mean, there's so much you said for me to think about, but at one point you said this is a political process, and it made me think health, just health is a political process. That because we spend time in medical settings, we see how health is so often constructed as a biological process, or and you're right that this is a political process that can be addressed with a lot of political solutions. Kevin, are you ready to share with us some thoughts? We're going to have to unmute you, Kevin.
Sorry. One of the theoretical centers of my research is citizenship, because I center my research on Black American citizenship and the contradictions of Black American citizenship, and speak of my writing about Black American HIV activism as a part of as these Black American activists and advocates, they come from a tradition of Black American civil rights activism. And I center it along with sort of health activism of the civil rights movement, and sort of recall health as a large part, often ignored part of the civil rights tradition. And they often talk about, this is a question that they often talk about, is like what it is that we need for equity. What do we need to actually be healthy? What do we need so that we're not the ones that are the last to be diagnosed, the ones to die first, the one to live the sicker life? And it's quite amazing because they have they speak of the social determinants of health. They know that it's not going to be the medicine, or they're like, we need jobs, we need housing, that's what we need. We don't need the things that people think we don't. It's not, the medicine is not going to do it. It's these things that I understand as rights of citizenship. You need you do need the healthcare, but you also need a good paying job. And they understand that, and you need housing, and you need the things that for 400, 500 years have been denied to Black Americans due to, racist democracy and racist capitalism, that has been denied to Black Americans, other, people of color, and that, as you said, that's what I largely see, is lots of inequality. But I think we find the road to equity by focusing on those who have been excluded, focusing on their dreams and aspirations. And I think, again, talking about why I do the work I do is because I see that, for those who have been, excluded from, within the context of the United States, which, practices a politics of abandonment, that's what is going on here. And those that are most marginalized, but yet those marginalized are still fighting for inclusion. Those are the ones who are aspiring, and that's where you find that dream, that way forward. And I think that's and that's what sort of keeps me going, and I think that's where we can find, as a country, that as Obama says, that audacity to move forward. And as Nancy said, we have the knowledge, and there are people out there who are paving the way with the policies and the know-how. And I think one of the things that, to speak to this current moment of racial injustice and moment, I think some of the things that makes me somewhat hopeful in this moment of horribleness is that there is growing, I think, attention to sort of I hope there's growing attention to sort of sociological or social scientific knowledge productions that demonstrate, the racial injustice and the productive knowledge that we help to produce as a discipline of science.
Thank you. That was an excellent point there at the end. I really shouldn't be commenting in between all of these, but you just said a lot of things there that, I mean, I appreciate this focus on the marginalization. That one thing that's occurred to me as I've been attending protests and rallies and listening to the speakers is that I think the white community, and I speak as a white person here, we think of these marginalized communities around the edge, and we think, okay, well, we'll just extend our range of concern so it includes the marginalized, but we never think, let's centralize the marginalized. Let's take everyone who's been on the margins and put them in the center and start from there. Let's just start over and rethink what that would look like if we focused on the needs of the marginalized.
Well, that's a problem in my work, because I speak about how, as I said in the introduction, the color of HIV/AIDS. And so I speak about how, I speak of that in my work, in my book, about how from 1981 to the early 90s, you have a regime of Black American exclusion, HIV, in sort of the HIV prevention field. And that's when whiteness is central, and particularly centered on gay white men.
Right.
And that's when all of the imagery and the prevention domain is all centered about largely on white gay men. And so excluded from that is concern and imagery on like women, on Black people generally. But then in the 90s, you start getting Black people, Black women, and other folk start being of concern to public health, and you get, but their concern is within an institutional infrastructure that has been built up by white Americans. And so they're now saying, oh, we see you Black people, you're dying, you're of concern, but all the the system that's built up has been built up by white people. And so there's this disjuncture, and so it's like that inclusion doesn't solve anything, because it's not there. It hasn't include, so it's just what
because you're still on the margin.
They move the people in, but that's why inclusion is not a panacea. Right. Because you're included in this system, this systematic racist institution. Mm-hmm. It doesn't change,
Yeah. Alexandra, are you ready to share?
Sure, thank you. I think if not in this response, and certainly some parts of the later discussion, I think what I'm saying about learning networks is going to bump right up against what Kevin is saying about inclusion not being a panacea. I mean, it couldn't be more true. Even when we have these healthcare structures where we broaden the sense of who a stakeholder is, it doesn't guarantee, as I will tell you, that, and as I'm sure you could have predicted, that it's going to result in the composition of people who have decision-making power that in any way reflects the population of the group that body represents. So from my point of view, when I'm thinking about medical practices scoped a little bit more narrowly on what might actually happen in a hospital or in a doctor's office or in one of these learning networks, the biggest challenge to achieving equality in medicine on some level is that not all stakeholders embrace the idea of equality in medicine because of the way it challenges existing hierarchies and divisions of labor and privileged positions of knowledge and expertise. So it seems to me that if I don't completely try to bust open the structure of a learning network, one immediate solution, or at least a pathway in that direction, is to put structural requirements in place for a variety of stakeholders to have decision-making power. Obviously, this is easier said than done, but one of the things that I noticed as I was reviewing Wright's work, which really resonated with my experience with the learning networks, is that, quote, the actual limits of what is achievable depend in part on the beliefs people hold about what sorts of alternatives are viable. So a question that I have that I continue to think about is, how can we create political will around the idea that equality is important? and I'm thinking in a much more narrowly scoped way about learning networks and about the people who populate them. And once the political will exists, it of course opens up a much more pragmatic space where we finally begin to deal with some of the tricky issues of implementation and things that come up that would prevent equality that I've noticed as I've been doing my research are things like who is a good patient or a good family partner, and sort of morally laden notions of who can participate, who's qualified to participate in decision making and agenda setting tasks. How can we ensure that patient and family partners have a real seat at the table and aren't just reduced to ceremonially recounting their stories of illness, which is something that very quickly happens, and it is a way of marginalizing patients and families who come to the table. They quickly find out, in some cases, often not in learning networks, but in other healthcare settings, that they're only there to tell their story and to maybe motivate everyone to care. And that's, I would argue that that's inadequate. Although I think there is a lot of value in honoring the stories and the experiences of patients and families that led them to be more engaged in this type of healthcare work. And one of the things that a learning network has to do is to identify a shared problem around which they can organize their work. So do all the stakeholders care about the same things? Which stakeholders matter the most when it comes to identifying problems of interest? And now that we have a shared problem of interest, how can we align around a shared agenda for addressing this problem? I think it's not self-evident which way it will go in a learning network when people come together to try to identify a shared problem of interest. And indeed, I've seen very heated discussions between different stakeholders about what the network should actually be working on. And the networks often defer, actually, it's one of their practices to defer to the patients and the families, to say that these are the things that you're living with, these are the things that are most important to you, that we will adopt that as our problem of interest, and you will play an important role in figuring out how we're going to do that. And it relies on flipping the script a little bit on expertise and who knows best. And one of the things that I keep coming back to is how highly patterned and routinized medical practice is. And my earlier work on medical training has shown that some of this is an adaptive response to things like consumerism and corporatization in medicine, and how working within these cultural constraints is actually trained in future physicians, and the way that they're actually taught to handle a patient encounter reflects corporatization and reflects patient consumerism. Sometimes breaking the routine and shaking things up is the hardest part, because it involves realigning these social relations that have become embedded in routinized patterns of interaction and are stabilized by larger social and economic structures. And so I keep coming back to the notion that in order to achieve equality and build an actually just society, people have to first be convinced that equality is actually an important goal. And that would be obviously people holding the power need to be convinced of this much more than others.
Right, excellent point. I mean, we're still debating whether or not systemic racism is real, right? This is, I mean, it's hard to be moving forward with solutions when more than half the country is like, I don't think that racism is systemic. Lots of good points, Alexandra. Thank you so much. I keep thinking how interesting it would be to hear how Nancy or Kevin would recommend setting up one of these learning networks. And maybe that'll come up in our discussion. So Nancy said something really provocative. She said, she talked about the sort of intrinsic relationship between liberal democracy and white supremacy. And Erik Olin Wright says that democracy is important in emancipatory social science. He defines it this way: in a fully democratic society, all people would have broadly equal access to the necessary means to participate meaningfully in decisions about things that affect their lives. So how might the concept of democracy be applied to medicine and healthcare in your particular field sites? And have you seen examples of this? What would need to happen to achieve democracy in the fields you study? Nancy, would you like to start again?
Sure, and I want to
Okay.
backtrack to the question that you posed, which I actually was thinking about for a while, because it reminded me of why I started the New Mexico Race, Gender, Class Data Policy Consortium. It sounds very much like the networks that you were describing, the learning networks. It was about creating a community of practice around critical race intersectional data collection and analysis, with the hope that it would change policy, not only in health, but also in education and beyond. So I think that is incredibly important, because if we can't collect data on things like race is different from origin and ethnicity, or LGBT status, or class origin, then we're only going to go so far, right? So I think it's incredibly important to create that community of practice by starting off with some core values, right?
Yeah.
We believe in equity. We believe in centering community wealth and not the knowledge that exists in the community about how to solve these problems. So now to just address the question of how democracy might be seen by critical race theorists, and this wasn't my idea, critical race theorists, which are primarily from the field of law, that became disillusioned when many of the reforms that were attempting to eradicate structural racism really haven't succeeded. For instance, I went to New York City public high schools and graduated in the mid-80s. And I went to a high school in the middle of Manhattan, in kind of Midtown area, 4,000 students, 0 white students. That hasn't changed, it's gotten worse. Across the street or 2 blocks away, there was a school that was primarily white and very low, poverty rate. So some of the things that we can think about is, how is it that even when we embrace the idea of democracy, Native American issues and Native American health concerns may be, placed at the margins? Think about a state like New Mexico, where 60% of the state is a member of an underrepresented racial or ethnic or tribal community. In this case, 50% Latino, about 10% Native American, but with very small percentages of Black, non-Hispanic, and white, it would be over a third. But still, when issues around, let's say, mining, or maybe it is issues about who has access to higher ed, democracy doesn't work for Native Americans. It doesn't work even for Hispanics when we think about structural power, right? And so this is why critical race theorists critique these liberal forms of democracy that are not centering historically oppressed groups and their voices and the solutions that they propose for things like health equity, health justice, completely abolishing systems of oppression like the prison industrial complex, right? So all of these things are problematic. But I think Patricia Hill Collins just published a book last year, Intersectionality as Critical Social Theory. And she talks about flexible solidarity as one of the ways in which you can remain rooted in your own experience. I am not Native American. I describe myself as a Black Latina from New York, Dominican, who is married to a brown-skinned Chicano who has historic roots here in New Mexico. And the idea that you can create a place where people can be rooted in their identities, but still understand the experience and the injustice that another group has experienced. So I think when we think about possibilities where we can get to a place of equality and we use a critical race intersectional lens, we can get to this place of flexible solidarity, where I can be in solidarity. And it was beautiful to see with all the protests recently over the murder of George Floyd, you would see signs like Indigenous lives in solidarity with Black Lives Matter. You saw people at these protests that were coming from almost every social location, white, Native, Latino, you name it. And so I think that there is a special moment now to advance this idea of flexible solidarity. And whether we call it democracy or not is not as important as what is happening, right? In what ways are these new social movements and conversations opening up ways of addressing intersectional justice and advancing that? That's how I would assume that we can get there. And there are policies, like I mentioned before. Derek Hamilton, who is the director of the Kirwan Institute, has worked with William Darity at Duke, and the Kirwan Institute is at Ohio State, have done the policy work on baby bonds, right? And how if we implemented that policy, we could probably chip away at intergenerational racialized wealth gaps in the Black community, the Indigenous community, and beyond. So we definitely can use those principles, I think, to advance a more just society, whether we call it democracy or not.
Thank you, Nancy. I think I'm going to rewatch this video like 10 times so I can listen to every point you made. So many good points in there. Kevin, can you take it from here?
I agree with Nancy. I just want to say that back to the equality questions, like, and democracy. Like, I think, you know, to get equality, I think we need like reparations, like for Black Americans, for other groups. And that's something that hasn't happened because the democratic system doesn't, within the United States, hasn't allowed it. You can't even get, you know, that bill that's been on the books forever to get studied through the democratic process, you know, to its pass. And I think, you know, and, you know, people have, and I think, you know, we in democracy, and I think a little, Erik Olin Wright, you know, I'm suspicious of you know, we have this, we reify and fetishize names and labels of stuff like democracy. Ooh, it's so great, and I'm always suspicious of such moves. And so, like Nancy, I'm like, it's not important what it's called, because I think when we call something, it becomes dangerous, and when we run after it. But I also think, like, even like Tocqueville, he recognized how U.S. democracy was dangerous, and we could have tyranny of the majority. You know, and he was this little French guy, not to you know, back way long time ago, and he saw how it could be dangerous. And I think we forget that. That's how we got the present president dangerous. You know, through democracy. You know, in the institutions. And I think we can see how democracy hasn't been a friend to a lot of people. To the world, it's been dangerous. Even as it has had this, you know, discourse, ethos of being a light towards the world and been so great, you know. But I do think this notion of all people having equal access is a great notion. But I think it might be handicapped, but if we attach it to this label of democracy, because I think, you know, some really great sociologists have you know, taught us, have shown how, you know, liberal democracy is anything but providing equal access to all groups. Mainly because, as we've spoken, those who, mostly Alexandra, those who have the power don't want to give it up, don't want to let others into the political chambers, for instance, you know. And I think, particularly talking about the Black community, and the Black politics, I think, you know, and I just happened to be reading, as I tell my students never to do this, like comments to an article, you know, on the news, and someone was talking, y'all are like, no, don't do that. And someone was talking, well, Blacks have had political power since the 70s, mayors of cities, and things like that. And then I think that's another example of showing how, like, democracy doesn't provide, you know, equality, equity. It's like, you know, and again, for some of the same reasons that we've been talking about, sort of because of systematic racism and the democracy in the United States. And so it's a question of how do we move beyond, I guess, in the sense that we've been sort of handicapped given the construction of this country. And since the beginning, our American democracy, US American democracy, has been constructed through racism and imperialism, colonialism. Okay. And so I might not be answering the question that you posed. You're muted.
And I don't mean to interrupt you if you're mid-thought.
No, go ahead.
But I think that one of the things you and Nancy are making me think about is, for a long time, there was this focus on equality. And then people said, wait, we don't want equality, we want equity. And I'm wondering if there's an analogy there, that equality is to equity as democracy is to flexible solidarity, or is there something else that says a democratic system, we're going to be dealing with the tyranny of the majority, but is there an alternative to democracy that allows for restoration and reparation? And you know how like the Electoral College gives people in Montana a bigger vote than people in New York? Like, is there something we could do that would allow marginalized communities to have a larger voice in the democratic process? And I'm just thinking out loud here, just based on the things that you've been talking about.
Mm-hmm. Well, there have been people like critical race theorists who have had proposals, like Melanie Grenier, who got in trouble when Clinton proposed that she become Attorney General. But I was just a kid when that happened. Not that I don't know, because I did grow up. But Alexandra, do you want to add something in?
Thanks, Kevin. I think I am gonna broadly agree with you and Nancy about some of the downsides or even potential dangers in just taking democracy as this ideal without really thinking about what it gets us and if it gets us what we want. And in thinking about responding to Liberty's question in the context of the learning networks, I first took the perspective of the learning network, and so I want to kind of show that, but then I want to talk about some ways in which it falls short, in ways in which they are aware of this shortcoming and are working on it. And so what I have seen is, this is consonant with my earlier comments, but an example of democracy that's being really nobly but imperfectly implemented at local levels in learning networks. And so when we're thinking about all of the different levels and strata of social structures and culture, learning networks are very close to the ground. And in some ways they do form a good arena for actually making change because it feels very concrete. And as I mentioned earlier, from the perspective of the learning networks, there is substantial political will to level medical hierarchies. This is embedded in their regular practices as of now. And they do bring more stakeholders to the table, and they do give those stakeholders real power to set agendas and make decisions in the context of quality improvement and outcomes assessment in healthcare. However, and as I say all these things, know that this is no surprise to the people who work in learning networks. It's one thing to have representatives from all stakeholder groups at the table, and it's quite another thing to have the representatives of those groups actually reflect the needs and the experiences of the group they are representing. And so this results, particularly on the side of the patient and family partners, in a similar situation to what we've seen in other studies of patient involvement in health social movements that Kevin referred to, in particular, what we saw with when white gay men became involved in scientific review panels in the early and middle years of HIV. What you end up seeing is obviously that patients with the greatest resources tend to be the most active participants in learning networks. And in this case, many of the patient and family partners are white women who are mothers of children who have the health conditions that the group is organized around. And this is not lost on them. And there are efforts underway to align the networks, to align network membership as a whole and participation with the broader demographic composition of the patient population that is affected by the primarily health conditions that these networks are organized around. And there is an emerging focus on health disparities that predates the much broader turn toward health disparities in light of COVID and in light of the ongoing Black Lives Matter movement. And so attending to barriers to participation and to inequitable patterns of recruitment of patient and family partners are two major issues that learning networks need to address in order to achieve democracy under Wright's definition. Although, as Nancy and Kevin both mentioned, not getting hung up on what we actually call it is an important part of this as well.
Thank you, Alexandra. All great points. We're going to move to the last of the three qualities of emancipatory social science, three principles. The last one is sustainability. And Wright defines sustainability as future generations should have access to the social and material conditions to live flourishing lives, at least at the same level as the present generation. So in your research field, what aspects of the system are sustainable or are not sustainable? And what would the system require to achieve sustainability?
For me, it would be universal healthcare. I mean, without a question. But again, if we're not addressing the root causes and the root social determinants, universal healthcare will only go so far. And I think about right now with COVID-19 and how the caseload of cases from indigenous nations is the highest, I think, in anywhere in the country. It's about 60% of our cases are members of indigenous nations. And until those structural inequities are erased, even if we have universal health care, if we're not having equal access to basic infrastructure, just basic, resources, that's not going to solve everything. It is a part of the solution. So that for me is incredibly important. And I think we're in a moment now where so many people have lost their jobs, and many of them, their health insurance was pegged to having a job, that maybe it will become sustainable and even a potential policy that will be implemented. I have hope that that could happen. I don't know what else we could do other than change what happens in most of our K-12 institutions that are not talking about things like structural racism, anti-Blackness, settler colonialism, heteropatriarchy, until we transform what passes as knowledge in most of our colleges and universities that are training people who will be teaching in the public school system. And that's a tall order, right? Because it's so decentralized. But I think that we can create models that show results, and we can organize and struggle to implement those models. And I keep mentioning the work that I do in education around the implementation of ethnic studies. And again, let's be clear, critical race, intersectional ethnic studies that are practicing flexible solidarity, are thinking about the violence that has been visited on, whether it's Native Americans, African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, etc., and our white brothers and sisters who also experience structural violence in the form of capitalism that denies them access to basic housing and things like that. So I think that this is a special moment, whether it is a crisis, but it could be a moment of transformation. It could be a moment of solidarity. It could be a moment where we see very different groups practicing flexible solidarity, but a lot needs to change in terms of the ways that people look at things like inequities the ways that people look at the humanity of others, the ways in which we can hope that many of these policies can actually make a difference. So I think it could be sustainable, universal healthcare, but more importantly, eliminating the fundamental causes of these very inhuman and preventable suffering that we are seeing all over this country and all over the world. I really do think that it is possible.
Thank you, Nancy. Kevin, would you like to speak on sustainability?
Oh, yes. This was hard for me to think about because I kept thinking about, well, we're in the Anthropocene and there's climate change and there's going to be like the world's going to change like really structurally, and then I can't help that's going to be a lot of people of color and poor people who most likely are going to die, and that's hard for me to think about. Because they're already dying, you know, and those who suffer most from climate change are people who are, you know, poor and folks of color, and so globally, and so I think that you know, they're not living. You know, they're not. So it's just hard for me to think about.
Your comments make me think about sustainability has kind of two meanings. Sometimes we think about it in terms of the environment, and sometimes we think about it in terms of systems, but they both have to be sustainable. I mean, the environment has to be sustainable in order for the system to be sustainable. And when I'm in the hospital, like the amount of plastic waste is like, it's amazing. Like, it is
so important about how the seas and oceans are like, but in 20 years, the amount of plastic in the oceans are gonna like quadruple or something.
Yeah.
Like,
and there is so much bio waste. I mean, so many needles and plastics that have touched things that, you know, it just makes you think, is healthcare even sustainable? I don't even know, but we'd like to have a system that can continue to take care of people. Alexandra.
Thanks, Liberty. So again, Kevin, you're making me zoom out a little bit, which I think is really great and very helpful for thinking with. My mind, when I read sustainability, went directly to financial sustainability and what the risks are of not having a sustainable financial model for running a health network or any sort of healthcare organization, and also what the risks are that a network might enter into in order to attain financial sustainability. And you know, this is a massive concern for learning networks, and I think that without very, very careful planning, it undermines the potential of learning networks to actually make good on some of their liberatory potential. It's something that I take very seriously, and something that I've seen the learning networks themselves take very seriously. The issue with them is that they are distributed across all of these different health networks. They are reliant on academic medical centers to pay fees to host a site of the network at their center. And then what's presented as a wise way of running a network is actually to have a diversified revenue stream, which can lead network leaders to look to places like medical device manufacturers and pharmaceutical companies for different forms of financial support and sponsorship. Of course, none of this comes for free. One of the most attractive things about learning networks is that they become very, very large repositories of valuable patient data that includes not only clinical data, but also patient-reported outcomes. And the this is obviously a commodity, right? As soon as you take the patient data and you begin to exchange it for money in the interest of financial sustainability, you've effectively commoditized all of this patient data, which has important ethical concerns, quite obviously. But this puts learning networks almost immediately in a compromised position where they have to make difficult choices about granting access to their databases, or even becoming sponsors for certain types of clinical trials, or becoming recruitment pathways for pharmaceutical companies and medical device makers to recruit patients into their industry trials. And so recognition of this issue by, not just by me, by the learning networks themselves, is spurring creative and interesting ways to rethink data governance practices to actually be more democratic. And I think the takeaway point for me here is that sustainability and democracy need to grow together, or else they will probably end up undermining one another and make this structure kind of fall apart, or make it very compromised and beholden to people who want to treat this data as a commodity, or not just treating it as a commodity, but who might want to use the data in ways that aren't consonant with how the network group would want the data to be used.
Thank you, Alexandra. All really good points. As we're winding down, I'm thinking we'll just, I want to collapse the last few questions together. So one of these questions is about our present context. Like, the pandemic has changed the everyday lives of people around the world, and the Black Lives Matter movement has gained momentum in many cities across America. How might your research provide a lens for understanding this particular socio-historical moment? How have these new developments in 2020 shed light on your research? But then if you just want to continue from there and each of you tell us what are policy changes you'd like to see, and then just generally some thoughts about utopias, like what can we take away from Erik Olin Wrights' work? Is it helpful to be thinking about medical utopias? Is it too optimistic? Is it allowing us maybe a space of creativity where we can reconsider what the system could look like? So I realize that's a lot to cover, but I kind of think there might be some overlapping in there anyway in your thoughts. Nancy, would you like to lead off again?
Sure. So I mentioned this earlier about the New Mexico race, gender, class data policy consortium, but really it's about creating a data infrastructure. Each of us work in organizations, whether it's in the university setting where we partner with departments of health or departments of education. Why can't we collect data on class, right? Educational attainment, class origin. What is your parental, at age 16, think about what was the highest level of education parent one had, parent two, etc. This is super important for shining a light on inequities and creating equity lifts and opportunities. So until we start collecting data that can help us make the invisible visible, we won't be able to name the problem. Too often I hear reports about, the incarceration rate or the rate of people who are infected with COVID, etc. But that data is often decontextualized and it's never intersectional. They're not reporting by race, gender, and class together, let alone LGBTQ status or anything like that. So that's one minor thing that each of us can do. Could you create a consortium around better data collection that allows for making the invisible visible? As far as a medical utopia, I mean, we have countries, we have even municipalities, whatever, that have implemented better systems than what we would say the average person has. So, I remember going to Cuba. It must have been like, 20 some odd years ago. And I was really amazed with the fact that, number one, their mortality rates for infants was actually better than like in the neighborhoods I grew up in, right? Where I'm presumably in a highly developed country. How is that even possible, right? Their literacy rate is better than many places that you can think of with similar circumstances. So I know that there are other places that would be considered more developed countries that have established medical utopias. So what lessons can we learn from them, right? Is there a way that we could create something different? We know very well that it is possible to reduce the inequity. Why is it so complicated to do it? I know I mentioned politics earlier, but right now we are in a political moment. We're in a political moment, again, of transformation, I believe. So, yeah, I think that that's going to go quite far in terms of creating what was envisioned with a utopia.
I love the idea of utopia. And that's only because I think we expect horribleness as a country, in part because we think we're schooled in dystopian futures, because we realize that we see it so much in our media. Everything is dystopian. And I think we create the future we expect. And we never see visions of utopias. It just never happens. Maybe they're boring or something, and we never see them, and so we don't expect them. And so I think it's good for us to think about them. And so in part, I think all of us sociologists should be thinking about, well, what's a utopian version of this? And all scholars and everybody should be thinking that, because I think then we will start to expect it. And I think particularly that, but I think we might get there if we start centering the people who have been excluded from the goodness of our world. And as Nancy said, we need to stop thinking, oh, I'm going to reinterpret what you said. We need to stop thinking that the United States is like, every time people say that, the United States is the greatest country ever, I was thinking, well, it's actually really awful, because there's so much inequity here. And there's so much, the fact that, I have family members. I think about the family members who have died in the rural places that I'm from because there are no hospitals, or there's no good hospitals, there's no health care. And think about how that is really quite common across the land of the United States, because the healthcare deserts, and I think how, how is that right, just? How is it even possible in like such the richest country in the world, And I think, in a utopia, that wouldn't be, and it need not be. And it could be different. I think we could create a different, but I think a part of it we expect it, and part of it is due to white supremacy. But it's hard, it's deep, because white supremacy is, it's a U.S. American as peanut butter, what I mean? It's like there, and so it's hard to get it out, but I think it can be done.
Kevin, I'm wondering, well, first of all, I appreciate your optimism. I think it's wonderful. And I love this idea that we can't have a future if we don't envision it. Or we're only going to end up with the future we create for ourselves and the one that we dream of. I also think, to both of your points, Kevin and Nancy, that you can go all around the world and people don't think it's crazy or radical to say we need universal health care. We're living in a very strange culture where to even suggest that is, just opens you up to all kinds of debate.
Well, I know, it's amazing. When I went to Amsterdam, I spent a lot of time in Amsterdam. When first time I went there, people walk up to me and say, I can't believe how people in your country treat your people. And I was just shocked, because now I was like, who, like just the old white people. And I was like, what? Because no one's ever said that to me in the United States, no white person. And I thought, oh my God, white people are different. That they had that positionality, that they could see that and say that. And I thought, well, what's wrong with white people in America? They can,
right?
And I thought, well, and so that's an example to me of how central white supremacy is to the United States.
Well, and Nancy makes a really great point that it starts in our K-12 education, right? We're fed this myth about the founding fathers, and everyone around the world knows it's a myth except Americans. Like, we believe it as our truth, and you go to England and they know it's a joke, and you know. But there was something else you said that I know. I wanted to ask you, how do you think this particular moment in the middle of a pandemic and with, protests happening across the country, has that changed your lens through which you see your data as you're writing your book?
Well, well, in a sense that I don't know. Well, it confirms what I've been writing about. It's funny because people are saying to me, "Oh, wow, your research is so current," and I'm like, "Well, I've been doing it for like 15, 20 years, like, and they're like, "Oh, it's so timely," and I'm like, "Well, I've been doing it for a long time now," but people are now seeing it as relevant.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's about what folks are seeing, I think, for the first time, or seeing as. And when it comes to Black people and HIV/AIDS, I feel like properly it becomes a story every 10 years. We're like, oh, Black people are really dying from HIV/AIDS, or they're really, it's really prevalent in the community. It becomes a New York Times story every 10 years. Like, oh, it's really high prevalent rate. And like Nancy, I'm really frustrated when they report the deaths as just there are 160,000 dead. And I'm like, well, who's dead? Like, I'm like, give me more context. And I'm like, that's, again, the exclusion of people. Because, like, it's not just people who are dead. The people have certain demographic detail, I think, that is missing, that render people invisible, And I think in a medical utopia, that wouldn't be. We would know, and then we will then have, detailed interventions.
Great. And I do look forward to reading your book. And it is very timely. And then Alexandra, would you like to share some final thoughts with us? And then we're going to turn some time over to Laura to discuss so much of what's been talked about today.
Thanks. I'm wondering if I can make my enthusiastic hopes and dreams for a medical utopia meet my policy hopes and dreams. Obviously, the policy that I think that we need, if I could just wave my magic wand, is universal health care, obviously, that's free at the point of demand to every person who needs it without any kind of restriction. And this, aside from demonstrable benefits in health and quality of life, would massively reduce cost in billing and would solve other problems like insurance portability by making insurance optional for those who want to add some kind of extra luxury coverage. And for the great majority of people in the US would make insurance obsolete. From a very global level, that would be what I would absolutely want to see. When it comes to thinking locally and thinking about how to create a medical utopia, yes, I definitely think that we should be not only thinking about medical utopias, but trying to make them. And there have always been alternative models, these sort of small models that give us alternatives, alternative ways to live and alternative ways to work and alternative ways to be. And these models have coexisted with dominant forms of institutions in every society. And often these small models are spaces that have been carved out through will and through creativity in the service of creating a more just world. And so while you see problems often arise when you try to scale these models up, there is value, I think, in trying to replicate these small models, identifying problems with them, particularly as they pertain to class and racial exclusivity, and trying to solve these problems in pragmatic ways and in just ways. And what I think a roadblock to something like this, a kind of pragmatic solution, is that people might be dismayed that this is an incremental solution, which I absolutely want to acknowledge. But I also am encouraged by the fact that it's already an act of emancipatory imagination to think of alternatives to things like the biomedical industrial complex. And it's important to acknowledge the creativity and the dedication that it takes to iteratively develop and vet viable alternatives in the service of justice and liberatory goals.
Okay. Muted. Thank you. Thanks, Alexandra. I think for Laura, do you feel like you're ready to maybe try to synthesize all of these ideas that we've shared? Thank you for being willing to do this and to provide some kind of concluding remarks for us that will help us frame a lot of what's been said.
Sure, not a problem. Just wanted really to begin by thanking you all for allowing me to be part of the discussion. To be a discussant of a discussion is a bit of a challenge. I don't think I can summarize, but I really want your incredible ideas and research and trajectories to stand in the moment. I'll make a few comments and also how I kind of came into this thinking with you as I was listening. I think that there's obviously a large shared theme of really thinking about the structural workings of power and focusing on the ways in which COVID-19, while some of us mentioned it, has really peeled back and revealed the social determinants of health, the fundamental causes, the structural workings of racism in particular, but other forms of intersectional injustices. COVID-19, though, has revealed this, but these things are not new. I know everybody could nod along with some of this, but the fact that they're not new also means that neither are the critical perspectives of rethinking new. That we may be providing something new in the moment, and I know each of you is doing that very thing, as along with many of our colleagues, but you've also pointed out, and I think really importantly, that critical race theory, intersectional theory, that there has been movements for reshifting the language to think about equity, to think about justice, to think about human rights, and that this work too has been going on a long time, and that this work I think is really important. When I looked at Erik Olin Wright and I thought about democracy and equality, and like you all, I mean, these are failed ideals. From a science and technology studies perspective, which is one of my fields, I think of them like Sheila Jasanoff has helped me to think about these as socio-technical imaginaries, right? These are imaginaries and ideals, but built into these imaginaries are prescriptions for who belongs, who gets included, how power operates in the production and the infrastructures of imaginaries. So one of the things that I just listen to you all and think is important is for us to kind of be cognizant of relying on the existing structures as we move forward and create our own imaginaries. And I do think it's important, and I feel the tension. I mean, it's a tension in all of us, like how much to rely on the existing structures when, there's extant literatures, experience, lived realities, in the moment and in histories that the existing structures exacerbate inequalities. It's almost like we're leveraging systems that themselves leverage and exacerbate and reproduce inequalities. So there is a time to rebuild, to re-envision, and I think that rebuilding and re-envisioning is important because of this point about the infrastructures, the very knowledges that are part of our systems and the ways they're, to use Ruha Benjamin's phrasing, they're encoded with inequality. And so they need to really be rebuilt from the beginning to how we put the systems together in the first place, which kind of gets to this we question, which I think you all have also been discussing, which is about the notion of participation, inclusion, stakeholders, who. And I think that even these emancipatory social sciences like ourselves, but certainly the infrastructures of power, have really failed also in the notion of participation, and failed in different ways. One of the comments that I wanted to think about it, while I agree with centering the margins and thinking about ensuring that knowledge production centers those who've been excluded, marginalized, mostly Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. But also, I think there's a failure in not recognizing the social movements and other kinds of expertise and work that has also always been here. So in other words, to recognize that people, Black people, Indigenous people, are engaging with knowledge, science, infrastructures all the time, and that it's one of the things I think about a lot is a failure of social science to think about participation, and to imagine that participation. This is Alexandra. I think part of your project is, does participation in infrastructural systems necessarily create some sort of emancipation? Nancy, I think you're, with the data collection appeal and moment, it's a similar kind of question. And I think there's tensions here that it's almost a both and, right? But the utopia asks us, well, to what extent are we going to rely on existing structures, and to what extent are we going to begin anew and to rebuild? And I guess I'll just leave my comments by saying that another thing I noticed, and maybe because of what I know about you all as well, is that there's experimental reimagining that you all do, and I think some of our social science colleagues do, maybe I don't know how many, and that is to be creative and experimental, and to be thinking about different ways to create kind of habitable or equitable projects, social science projects, equitable, habitable, even systems that we're involved in. We are all part of this higher education in some ways, and I know very differently positioned, which is part of the power and imbalance of the intersectional injustices. But I think I'm hopeful by many things. I don't know how I got there, but I am hopeful by many things, and some of it is the sort of social movements that are happening around us and have been happening for Black Lives Matter, and also around biomedical infrastructure change. But I'm also hopeful in the social science enterprise in terms of really trying to imagine experimental shared objects of thinking together, and being able to ourselves be participants in shifting some of the structures that are in place from our various social positions that we find ourselves in. So I just really want to thank you for allowing me to kind of talk, and there's so much here. This is not just presenting on your research, but I really see you all as the kind of vision for allowing social science to be emancipatory in both bringing critical theories to the table that are here around equity, justice, and human rights, and also being experimental in how to be pragmatic in changing some of the infrastructures that we have in terms of what data, what collection, who's at the table, and then also in imagining new structures and not relying on the ones we have in place. What kinds of new structures do we need for the kind of world that's habitable, joyful, that we want to kind of live in going forward, where we're not, like Kevin, I really appreciated the kind of sadness of living in the world where we continue to document the deaths and inequalities and the ones that we know are coming in terms of who lives and who dies. Sustainability is a difficult word, I think, given how where we are and how it's been used. But just thank you all. I don't know if that doesn't create more discussion, because I feel like you had a discussion.
Oh, that was fantastic. Bravo, Laura. Thank you so much for sort of tying all these loose ends together. I want to thank each of you personally. I mean, I think that each of your work contributes, makes a huge contribution to sociological understandings of biomedicine and healthcare. But just on a very personal note, I mean, there were so many comments that were made today that really have inspired me and forced me to think a little bit differently about my own data and my own work. And I do think, Zoom is not the best maybe venue for a conference, but the nice thing is that this is recorded and I can go back and hear your ideas again and think about really what they mean for my own research, which is a little bit selfish, but I'm very grateful for that. So thank you all very much. And
Could I make one point about the emancipatory social science?
Yes, please.
And sociology, I feel like that's a very hard thing, because I think back to my article in Sociology, Health and Illness. I was shocked when it was accepted with conditional things,
revisions,
provisions, and the editors wanted me to change. The biggest thing they wanted to change was my use of the phrase white supremacists, because I said that the centering of white gay men, and even when folks were saying things like, well, the first people who appeared in the surveillance data were white, but the fourth and fifth were black, but we didn't pay, it wasn't a big deal to us. And we knew black folks, but we didn't talk about it. And I was like, well, that's an example of white supremacy, the centering on white, and the fact that they didn't pay attention, as other folks have noted, that it was the white Americans who would appear in the doctor's office because they have the resources. And I that's an example of white supremacy. And they're like, that you can't say that. And I was like, what do you mean I can't say it? And they're like, well, and then people told me, well, Kevin, you have to take it out because. And I was like, I was so confused. Like, how can I not say that?
Kevin, I think I can guess what race your reviewers were.
Well, you would be surprised, because I've had a very similar response when I present my research, and you would be surprised what the race of the person who said that was. It's not who you think. It's both and. So I'll give you one other example, and I couldn't agree with you more, Kevin. There is policing of who has academic freedom, right? And it doesn't only happen in tenure promotion committees, but it also happens in reviews for journals, and it also happens when you apply for grants. So I had one program officer at a very prestigious funding agency tell me that intersectionality was analytical laziness. And this individual proceeded to tell me that I should focus on race or gender or class, and that I should not appear to care about one group more than the other because there are plenty of poor white people. And this to me just signaled that this individual had never read anything on intersectionality. Because of course we are looking for intersectional justice, whoever is experiencing it. But the point is, yes, I've had responses from even people of color, but predominantly whites, who will not allow me to use the word white supremacy either in a publication or in a public presentation, or will silence it and dismiss it as a structure, right? And so I could not agree with you more. Under what conditions is knowledge production on these injustices possible, either in funding, publication, tenure and promotion, and I would add hiring.
Mhm.
We could each do audit studies of letters that go out and mention white supremacy or critical race theory, intersectionality, and see what the outcome is. So this is a serious issue. It is a battle.
I mean, I hope that there's a way that Kevin can write about this and that it can be heard. I mean, you know, whether it's a piece for Chronicle of Higher Education or maybe a more, you know, maybe a research article. Because I think that you are talking about some very important issues around knowledge production that probably a lot of people don't realize and are blind to within the academy.
I also had a question about how many of us went to a program that required a course on race or intersectionality. And I can't raise my hand, FYI. And I went to the City University of New York. It wasn't required.
Are you talking for undergraduate or graduate?
Both and.
Mm-hmm.
So that's volumes. You know, what's required knowledge before you get a degree in all of our social science disciplines.
Mm-hmm.
Very few will require this kind of critical analysis of structural racism, white supremacy, or intersectional violence.
Yeah. I'm proud to be in California where we're passing the ethnic studies required.
I saw that.
In the CSU, yeah.
Well, I have
Thank
a
you.
master's degree in cultural studies, so I had training in it before I went to sociology. That's why I found sociology so odd when I first started. I only started as a grad student, and I was like, "What are we reading?" And then,
Yes.
or we're reading things wrong. like what? This Marx. What are we? This is not how you read Marx. But then,
And then the fear is when it becomes institutionalized, it'll be co-opted, right?
Yeah.
We have also seen instances where, let's say, you know, there is some kind of requirement, but then it becomes.
and then I was like, why aren't we reading Du Bois? And then we went to our department, like, because Liberty and Alexandra, we all went to UCSD, and they wouldn't let us read Du Bois.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Okay, I gotta go.
Okay. Thank you all very much. I hope you all
Good
have a
to see you,
wonderful
Nancy.
day.
Good to see you, Laura.
Thank you for this
Wow.
conversation. It's been
Thank you,
great.
Liberty, for getting us together.
Thank you.
Thank
Great.
each of you.
Yes.
Okay, well, have a great day. And actually, I hope you find it time to enjoy more virtual events at the ASA virtual engagement event that's going on this weekend. So take care and goodbye.
Bye-bye. Have a great.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.